Well, today is first Sunday after Thanksgiving, and typically in church, the first Sunday after Thanksgiving is the first Sunday of Advent. But this year's a little bit different because we have an extra Sunday. And I'm not sure why that is, it just works out that way in the calendar, that next Sunday is the first Sunday of Advent. Today is, we're not quite there yet, but we're going to go ahead and get started looking at the Christmas story anyway. As we think about Advent, some of you might not be familiar with what that is. But Advent is a season of the Christian calendar where we prepare for the celebration of the birth of Jesus. Now, in our world, we prepare for Christmas in many different ways. We decorate, we make lists, we go shopping, we bake things, we go to different special events for the holiday season. We do lots of things to prepare. How many of you have a Christmas tree up yet? Some of you? Yeah? And so we're already making preparations for the holiday season. But when we talk about Advent, we're talking about a different kind of preparation. This is more of an inward preparation where we're not necessarily doing anything, but we are focusing our attention on the coming of Jesus. Now, obviously, Jesus has already come. Right? He was born a long time ago. This is not the first time that we've done this. But what this means is we're preparing ourselves to be open and receptive to the way God can use us and the way God can speak to us. Something we should do year-round. But sometimes it's good to have a season where we can be reminded to do that. And especially this time of the year when things are really busy, it's good to remember to slow down and to spend some time thinking about what Jesus' presence in my life means. And so, Advent, even though it starts next week, we're going to start. We're taking a look at the Christmas story, the different characters in the Christmas story, and there's quite a few. And so today we're going to look at the very beginning of the story. Zachariah and Elizabeth are not as well known as some of the other people in the Christmas story. They're not at the Nativity. We don't usually include them in our reading of the Christmas story on Christmas Eve. And so we usually don't think of them. We don't have a lot of Christmas songs written about them. They are kind of, in a way, in the background of the story, and yet they are very important. And so as we look at Zachariah and Elizabeth, who are they? Well, Zachariah was a priest. And so he served God in the temple. And he was older, probably in his 70s or 80s. And he was past the age of childbearing, so he and his wife Elizabeth have never been able to have children. Now the Bible says that they are righteous and blameless. Now usually when we think of blameless, we think, wow, they're perfect. You know, they've never made a mistake. But that's not what they're saying here. The Bible has never been a book that tries to paint the people in it as being perfect. You know, their imperfections are glaringly clear. And so when they say that they are blameless, it doesn't mean they're perfect, but what it means is that they are trying their best to follow God and to follow the law of God. And so Zachariah and Elizabeth are blameless, let's say, but they could not have children. And this is interesting because in the Bible, usually when women cannot have children, it is assumed that something is wrong. And so typically they are said to be cursed by God. And that negative stereotype has unfortunately continued into the present day, as oftentimes when women are unable to have children, they are saying, some people believe something is wrong with them beyond just the medical reasons, but something must be wrong with them, and sometimes they feel that something's wrong with themselves. And so it's good to see this breaking of the stereotype here with Zachariah and Elizabeth, where it says that she is blameless, so she hasn't done anything wrong. She's not cursed by God. But nonetheless, she was unable to have children. And so here are these two, and they're going about their daily, regular lives. This is not an exciting story at first. You know, the time has come for Zachariah, it's his turn, to burn incense in the temple. This is a special time because he goes into the Holy of Holies, the most innermost room in the temple, where typically a priest goes only once a year. And so this is kind of a big deal. It's kind of like Christmas, you know, is kind of the biggest deal of the year at church, or Easter. You know, one of those really big days. But it's still kind of business as usual for Zachariah. He's a priest after all. So he goes into the room and he's burning incense, which is a typical way that they would worship and give up an offering to God. And I don't know if Zachariah expected anything to happen or not, or if it was just routine, but an angel appears, and he's terrified. This is interesting, isn't it? Whenever somebody sees an angel in the Bible, they are terrified. When was the last time you were terrified? You know? I mean, it's one thing to be scared, but I like the way the version said it, terrified. You know, the only time I remember when I was a kid on Halloween, we'd go trick-or-treating, and we went to a house that was kind of set up as, it wasn't a haunted house, but it was set up that, and there were all these scary things in the yard and stuff, and so we were going, and we were in the yard, and my dad and sisters were going to look at some more of the stuff in the yard, and I would not move. I could not move. My feet were planted still, and I was not moving. So they let me stay there, and they didn't go too far off, but they let me stay there, and I waited for them. I could not move. I was terrified. You know, usually we don't think of that kind of a response for angels. Usually, if we think about the way Hollywood depicts angels, some of the popular images, we think of comforting beings. You know, a person in a white gown and wings on their back, or a cherub or something like that. But usually something comforting. We don't think of something terrifying, but every time in the Bible, the angels have to give a disclaimer. They say, don't be afraid first before they say anything else. So it must be quite an event to have a visit from an angel. And so after the angel gives the disclaimer, he says, his name's Gabriel, he says, the announcement that you and your wife, you're going to have a child. Surprise. And Zachariah is not sure what to think about this, which is not that hard to believe. And so, because he doubts, the angel says, well, you are not going to be able to speak until the child is born. Now, we've seen this story repeated in the Bible a number of times when there's an older couple who are going to have a child when they thought they couldn't have a child, and then usually they doubt. I mean, who could blame them? You know? But he can't speak anymore. And so, in the course of time, Elizabeth becomes pregnant. And it says that she hides it for 5 months. We don't say why. They don't say why. We don't learn for sure why she goes into seclusion for 5 months. Practically speaking, if they had been unable to have children, they probably tried for years and years, and probably went through miscarriages. And so it could be that, you know, perhaps because A, they're older, and B, because of what they went through, perhaps they didn't want to have to tell people about another miscarriage. And so maybe that's why she hid for 5 months. We don't know for sure. But we know that she was in seclusion for 5 months. Now, Zachariah and Elizabeth are happy about this. You know, they are. They're happy about this. Because that's something that we need to be clear of, because how many of you, if you're in your 70s or 80s, would be excited to learn that you're pregnant? Wow, so much on your plate. And so you can expect why maybe they had a mix of emotions about it, but there was some definite joy because they wanted to have children, and also because this meant that the Messiah was coming. The angel was clear that this child, John, who would be John the Baptist, was going to prepare the way for the Messiah. So the Messiah was coming soon. And so all the people are excited about this. They've been expectant. They've been waiting because they've been living under oppression from foreign power for too long. When the scriptures say that God, according to God, they're supposed to be free, they're supposed to be independent, they're supposed to be on top, they're supposed to have their own king. When is this going to happen? When is their king going to come? Now it's going to happen. And so they're excited. So this is an interesting story, isn't it? And one of the reasons why it's interesting is that other than the visit from the angel and what happened after, this wasn't that extraordinary. I mean, think about other people in the Bible and what they do. Moses confronts Pharaoh and brings an end to a 400-year institution of slavery. You know, Zachariah goes into the temple and burns incense. Okay? Not exactly as impressive of a resume, let's say. Zachariah is not the same type of leader as Moses. Zachariah doesn't lead a group of people to a promised land. He just goes into the temple and burns incense, right? Sometimes what we find from this story is that God can use people when they are doing normal things. During ordinary days, just doing your everyday normal stuff, God can use you, and God can do extraordinary things. Sometimes, we forget that. And that's one thing that we can learn from this story. Sometimes we think that if God is going to use us, we're going to have to do something really special. Maybe it's go on a mission trip, or go on a retreat, or maybe it's to lead a new ministry, or to join a new ministry. Those are all wonderful things. But at the same time, I think it's good to ask the question, how does my faith affect what I do at work, at school, at home? How does my faith affect what I do? Because during the everyday, normal, forgetful days, in other words, those days where nothing really, those days, the ordinary ones where nothing really big happens, you get up, you eat, you go to work, you go to bed, it's just a normal day. Even in those days, God can use you. And maybe you can look back and you can think of some times in your life when God has used you during a normal day and you didn't realize it at the time. But are you open to the fact that God could be using you? That perhaps you could have an encounter with God, maybe not just a visit from an angel, but some kind of an encounter with God where you can be a part of God's plan just because you're there for no other reason? Could be. The other thing I want to look at with this story is Elizabeth and her relationship with Mary, the mother of Jesus. Now, we'll be focusing more on Mary and Joseph next week, but Elizabeth and Mary were cousins. And so when Elizabeth is 6 months pregnant, the angel Gabriel visits Mary and gives his announcement to her, saying, you're going to have a child and conceive as a virgin, and your child is going to be Jesus. And so it's interesting that the angel, it's like the angel knew that she would need somebody for encouragement. The angel says, your cousin Elizabeth is also pregnant. And so one of the first things that Mary does is she goes to visit Elizabeth, even though this would take about 9 days to get to where Elizabeth lives. Mary goes to visit Elizabeth right away. She probably needed encouragement. She was probably a mixture, but she was probably scared because here she is, she's pregnant and she's not married. So what's this look like? What are people going to say? How do I do this? And so she's probably fearful, and so she needs some encouragement. So she goes to Elizabeth, who is also impossibly pregnant, right? These are two women who are impossibly pregnant. One because she's past the age of childbearing, the other because she's not married yet. And so these are both impossible. And so they come together, and she's seeking encouragement, and encouragement is what she gets. Because when she visits Elizabeth says that her baby leapt in her womb. She had some kind of feeling. God spoke to her and said that Mary was pregnant. And so she comes to Mary and she says, blessed are you among women. And she says a number of things, but she uses the word blessed 3 times, just full of encouragement. And then Mary responds with a song of praise in which she thanks God for being blessed and being used by God for God's plan. It kind of changes how we think about the word blessing. Usually when we think of somebody being blessed, we think that they have a decent house, they have a good job, they have enough money to get by, or maybe even more than that. But usually we think of blessing as far as provisions and possessions. But here for Elizabeth and Mary, they consider themselves blessed not because of anything that they've gotten, but because they are able to be used by God for God's will. And maybe that helps us to think about what it means to be blessed. Maybe for us, being blessed is not necessarily things, but being blessed is being able to be used by God for something. What larger honor is there than that? And so Mary and Elizabeth, they encourage one another during this time. And so as we look at that aspect of the story, we have to think about Who is the Elizabeth in your life? Who is the person in your life who encourages you? We go through life and we all have people in our lives, and maybe there's somebody in your life who is an encourager. Somebody who always has some word of encouragement for you, always somehow leaves you feeling better. Maybe it's somebody who's older, like in the case of Mary and Elizabeth, who's been around for a while and has lived to tell a story, and so they have wisdom to share. Maybe not. Maybe they're the same age or younger even. But who is your Elizabeth? Somebody who encourages you. And then who is your Mary? Who are you encouraging? There may be somebody, it could be younger than you, but it doesn't have to be. Somebody that you are mentoring. Now, not necessarily in an official mentoring relationship like confirmation, but who are you encouraging in this life? Maybe you have some wisdom to share too. You might say, no, I don't have any wisdom. But maybe you do. We all have a certain amount of wisdom because we all have certain life experiences that we've gone through, and we can share what we have learned with other people, and we can encourage them in their time. So what does it mean? Think about that in your own life. Who is your Elizabeth and who is your Mary? Who are you encouraged by, and who are you currently trying to encourage? And if you have your eyes open to that, maybe you can't name anyone right now, but if you have your eyes open to that, maybe you can seek it out. Maybe you can seek out someone who needs encouragement, and you can be aware of that. It doesn't have to be this big official project. It can just be in the moment, in the time, saying an encouraging word, giving them encouraging, advice or something that can help lift them up. But think about that. Zachariah and Elizabeth, as I said, they don't have grand stories. They didn't do anything extraordinary. We don't usually remember them. We don't hear about them very often. But what a story. A story of them being available to be used by God in the ordinary, everyday things. So may we also be available to be used by God, to be blessed by God, even in the ordinary days as we go about our daily business.